Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 6 in the Deep Dive series, and this episode promises to be probably one of the most controversial and hopefully interesting in the series. In this episode, I'm going to show how significant the red gas can is to solving the riddle of the shadows on the driveway. I'm going to be taking you through the actual video step by step. We're going to be moving from the basement up the stairs, following Watts's route through that little corridor, into the garage, out the garage door and down the driveway. We're going to be looking at it from above, from the side, from the camera view and so on. Now, I know many of you watching feel like you are experts on the Watts case, and given the amount of information many of us have consumed, it does feel like we should be experts, given the discovery that has been at our disposal for over 2 years, given the amount of videos we've watched and information we've meticulously gone through. It feels like we know just about all there is to know. And this video is going to challenge that. And at the same time, I'm going to be introducing you to a new concept, which is called a heuristic. Now, before we get to heuristics, I'm going to ask you 3 simple questions, and if you can, please answer the question by leaving a comment. And the 3 questions are: what is the color of Chris Watts' truck? Please don't look at anyone else's answer, just answer what you think the answer is. What is the color of Chris Watts' truck? Now, the discovery actually gives 3 different versions. One of them is that it's white, and another version that it's, 2 different colors. Then, number 2, besides the shirt and sandals that Shanann was wearing on the Ring doorbell camera, what else was she wearing? And then finally, was the shirt that Shanann wore when she arrived home ever recovered? So if you can leave your answers in the comments, we will address that at the end of this episode. And I think some of you will be quite surprised, especially regarding the second question. So in terms of this whole business about the shadow in the driveway, what it really comes down to is a heuristic. A heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. These rule of thumb strategies shorten decision-making time and allow people to function without constantly stopping to think about their next course of action. So that's all it is. A heuristic is a mental shortcut. It is making up your mind about something within a complicated scenario of lots of information, and based on that you sort of simplify everything. And as a result, heuristics are often wrong. Sometimes they're not, sometimes they're right, but they're often wrong. And we are going to look at the shadow on the driveway as a heuristic. By way of introduction, I want to talk about some of the polls I've done, both on YouTube and Patreon. And in the polls, I've asked, in fact, I asked about a month ago, I said, what is your position 2 years after the fact on the shadows? And most people said, by a slim majority, said the shadow is definitely a child, right? 42% of people on YouTube said, they took the poll, that the shadow is definitely a child. Slightly less than that said, I'm still not sure. And a tiny, not a tiny, but about half of both of those voters said, well, I think it's something else. It's not a child, and I'm sure that it's not a child. It is interesting that almost as many who said the shadow is definitely a child said that they're not sure. Now, if you compare that poll to the one that I did on Patreon, it was completely the opposite. By far the most people said the shadow is something else, virtually nobody said the shadow is definitely a child, and a fair proportion said, I'm still not sure. So in other words, you had an inversion of the folks on Patreon, on the True Crime Rocket Science site on Patreon, of what just the sort of ordinary people were saying on YouTube on the same subject. And to be honest, I've gone through all three of those. There were times where I thought the shadow was definitely something else. There were times where I was not sure. There were times where I thought the shadow is definitely a child. And I probably cycled through all three of those answers a couple of times. I'm not going to tell you what I think about it right now. That'll be revealed by the end of this episode. But I do think when you're in that position where you say, well, it's definitely this, it's definitely not that, and I'm not sure, well, what you're dealing with ultimately is uncertainty. So I can be quite forthright and say I was definitely quite uncertain at various times about what I was looking at when I saw the shadow on the driveway. Were you, or were you always certain? Now, just to kind of contextualize what we're talking about, Agent Coder did actually ask Chris Watts about that. He asked him about effectively asked him about the shadows on the driveway, but without really saying that. He basically said, were the children still alive after Shanann died or not? And that's really what it comes down to. When you see the shadow on the driveway, it becomes a heuristic for either the children were still alive, or if you don't believe it, that they weren't alive. And of course, as soon as the children are still alive, then it sort of opens the door to all sorts of other conspiracies about who might have been involved in what was going on.
Is there any reason you would feel uncomfortable to tell me that they were not alive at that point?
No.
Okay.
Wasn't it a video or anything?
It's hard to see. Well, they got into the truck with you and were alive. Okay. Are you 100% sure that's true? Okay.
So the point of that was just to show how Coder himself was also uncertain, because bear in mind all these shadow videos came out in December and January, and I think was part of the reason that prompted them to go and interview Chris Watts. I mean, there were other reasons as well. At the time, he'd only given them the first confession, effectively blaming Shanann, and they still wanted to know, so what did happen? They still wanted him to admit on tape, to them, what he'd done to the children. Maybe it was to close the door in terms of a plea deal. Maybe it was something like that. I do sort of get the sense that they tricked him, because they at some point communicated that everything was over and what they were going to say would be private. And then what happened? It became public as well. So I do think there was a sense, he may have a sense that he was played, not just once but twice. And I kind of think the same kind of goes for a lot of people on YouTube, have also been played by opportunistic YouTubers. It's quite simple how YouTube works. I mean, I'm now a bit more familiar with it myself. You say something that you know is going to catch on. You see where ideas are more popular, and so you give the audience what they want. You don't necessarily say what's likely or say what's reality. You say what is going to get a lot of people gossiping and talking and conjecturing, and that is how it sort of gets a little bit out of hand. So just in a general sense, when we look at heuristics, what kind of happens is, try to imagine kind of a big ball, almost like a pizza, and that whole pizza, that whole ball is like what happens in the world, and a small little tiny fragment, almost like one little olive on the pizza, or one little piece of tomato, or one piece of, what do they call it, feta cheese, is what is sort of covered in the news or that is dealt with somewhere. In other words, reality is this huge ball, and the part that we think we know is the small little morsel. And that is the availability heuristic. You think because you watched a news bulletin, you know about, let's say, the coronavirus, or you think because you watched a news bulletin, you know what's going to happen in a particular election. And there's far more going on. It's far more of a complex thing that is at work. And in the Watts case, what you want to do is not just take one thing and make that the entire story of the Watts case. You want to integrate all the information so that it all fits together. And as far as I'm concerned, the shadows running around the driveway, it doesn't fit with anything else. Certainly doesn't fit with a premeditated murder. It doesn't fit with the fact that Watts couldn't take photos of his children or couldn't send photos of his children when his wife asked for them at 7:45 on Sunday night. Why? Because they weren't alive, they weren't in bed. So in the same way that there's a distortion based on the availability heuristic, there's also distortion based on the fact that with the CCTV footage from Nathaniel Trinasich, and bear in mind there's no CCTV footage simultaneously from the Ring doorbell camera, even though there should have been, which would have given a fuller perspective. But because there's only this footage from Nathaniel Trinasich's side, it is through a tiny little fragment that we are seeing things, and that is exactly what the availability heuristic is. It's a tiny fragment of a whole, and so you've got to kind of ask yourself, if you could turn the lights on, what would you see? In other words, if you could illuminate the whole scene and make it happen in broad daylight, what would you see? Secondly, if you could put a camera on the other side of the truck, or you could stand right there on the other side of the truck, what would you see? What would he be loading? And there's an answer besides bodies. He had to have loaded a shovel, because we know that was inside the truck. We know we sort of in part saw him loading a red gas can, and we'll deal with that in more detail. But he also loaded a red water jug, right? Then he also had to load his change of clothing. The clothing that he left in from Saratoga Trails, not the same clothing he arrived in. He's not wearing the same shoes either. He also needed to pack other things, but we'll get to that in a moment. But we would have had a better idea of him doing all that if we could see from the other side. Also, if we could have stood in the garage and saw what he was bringing into the garage, right? So when we talk about that, what we're really addressing is shortcomings with the CCTV footage. We're saying if only there was another camera on the other side, if only the lighting was better, if only we had a better angle on what's going on, then we wouldn't need a heuristic. We would simply see it. It would be the full picture, right? And although you might appreciate that concept, we need to address that, and that'll be the final point, I think, the 7th or 8th point in this episode, dealing with the shortcomings of CCTV footage. But what I want to do now is take you on the route that what should have taken from the basement to the garage. And I believe that he had all three bodies in the basement. And I believe that the bodies were in the basement because that's where they needed to be so he could clean up the rest of the house. He probably may have done a little bit of treating of the bodies in the basement, meaning they could have been refrigerated, they could have been basically just packaged in plastic and also in containers. I mean, that would be where you would source those materials. But essentially, he needed them to be somewhere out of sight between around about 2 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock. and it would make sense to have them in the basement because the basement's not very far from the garage, and as I say, it's out of sight. Also, if there were going to be smells, the basement would be one of the last places anyone would go and look. And I don't remember Nicole Atkinson looking in the basement. The other thing is the basement's really big, so if you did leave the bodies somewhere, you would have quite a job knowing where to look for them. Now, if we go through Jeff Hibbett's sort of exit out of the basement, we actually have Officer Lyons sort of shadowing him, and he's kind of in the corner, basically saying, there's a mat here that we need to look at. My dog's shown interest in it, and it's possible that that mat was used. In any event, Officer Lyons then follows him out the basement. So there you can see the refrigerators. And now we follow Jeff Hibbett up the stairs. You can actually hear him in the original audio that they are wooden stairs. It sort of clunks as he sort of goes up the stairs. And there are a pair of shoes over there, and then the dog sort of comes out. Then Officer Lyons redirects him, and the garage is the other way, and she then leads the way. And there she opens the door. You can see the Vivint sensor there on the left. And then he enters the garage, and we'll just cut it off there. Okay, so we will come back to that footage, but I just want to take you step by step through a couple of areas as we exit the basement. So I've mentioned that the staircase sounds like it's wooden, but for whatever it is, you can hear when someone goes down the basement or up the basement. And because of that, I don't think the murder happened in the basement. I don't think that is where Chris Watts is waiting. I think Shanann would have heard him coming up from the basement, and I don't think Shanann would have gone down into the basement if Watts was sleeping in the basement. She would have just gone to sleep, gone upstairs and gone to sleep. The other thing is, Watts couldn't have slept in the basement because he was supposed to be looking after his children. So that just doesn't make any sense. So something that I observed just looking at the body cam footage just slowly is, as the officer exits, and I think this was Coonrod. So some of the footage is from Coonrod, some of it is from Officer Lyons. But you see what looks like a disturbed surface of the carpet, the light catching the ruffled surface layer of the carpet on the right hand side. And this is possibly where the body was dragged to the edge of the stairs and then I guess carried down to the basement of the stairs. Now that's quite important to stress, is it would be difficult to carry Shanann's body very far because it was heavy. So I don't think Shanann's body went much further than the bottom of the basement stairs, and that is where it appears dogs showed interest. We know Jeff Hibbett's dog showed interest there. Jane's dog also seemed to bark in that area. The interest that Hibbett's dog showed is difficult to say whether it was coming from that same area but behind it, or from actually in the area below the stairs. So there's a little bit of an inconsistency there. But when we look at a reverse image, you can quite clearly see that it's not just light, that the carpet does appear to have been rubbed strongly. Now bear in mind that could also be from cleaning. So whether there was an original dragging of someone over that area, you could also have had rubbing subsequently over it. And then it could also just be nothing. It could also just be that is the route people take generally when they come up out of the basement. They go from there to the kitchen, or they go from there to the lounge. It could be that. I just don't think it is. It could also be a trick of the light, the fact that the light was shining from that area, but it certainly looks like the carpet has been ruffled. But we've got to be careful in terms of cognitive bias, knowing what the end result is and then seeing things that aren't necessarily there. We've just got to be careful. So I do believe the children were transferred from the kitchen or lounge area of the house. I don't think they ever went to bed, just in the same way I don't think Shanann ever went to bed. Chris Watts, bear in mind, he was trying to get rid of his family, and the whole idea of them having another night's rest wasn't part of his plans for them. He wanted to get back to Kessinger, and he certainly was going to wait for his family members to sort of go to sleep, put them to bed, go through the trouble of them being in bed and waking up on their own time. This was him taking control. Anyway, when we move now to the garage, you can kind of imagine that Watts would have loaded the containers of the plastic containers in the basement with his children, who were in turn wrapped in plastic bags as well, as horrible as that sounds. And then carrying them from there to the garage, I don't think would have left really any scent traces, especially if he then cleaned the garage and also cleaned the containers, and I think that is what happened. One thing we need to bear in mind is just how long he spent loading, in inverted commas, his truck. It went on from about 18 minutes past 5 till about 5:45. So, easily 27 minutes. It's a long time. And if it was just one body, you would have thought, well, why couldn't it have been 10 minutes? Why was it half an hour? And I think part of it was that he was loading in secret. Part of it was that he would then move the truck forward. Part of it was that I think he would clean up the basement after he'd loaded his truck. So I think that was also part of it. He thought leaving nothing to chance. Something else I believe he took with him and disposed of on this trip to Survey 319 and coming back somewhere along that trip was the oxycodone bottles that he'd used to try to poison Shanann and then overdose his children. So I believe that is also something that disappeared from the scene. Now, in terms of the garage, what you've got to bear in mind is there's going to be like a flow of traffic from the basement past the vehicle and then to his truck that's parked there, that is backed up, right? So in other words, because he's going to be doing at least 3 trips to the basement and back, and then probably maybe another 1 or 2 to do cleaning up after that, he kind of needs there to be a free way of accessing and exiting the scene. And you can actually see when Hibbert enters the garage that there's nothing in his way. There's nothing that is going to stop you from going the route that he's going, beside the car and past the car, through the garage door and onto the driveway. Does that make sense? Now, we need to get a much better orientation from the Trinastich house towards the Watts home, and when we do get that orientation, we can see that the Trinastich, the end of the Trinastich porch draws level with the front of the garage of the Watts home, meaning the camera's looking past the entrance. It can't actually look inside the entrance of the Watts home, of the Watts garage, and that is to Watts' advantage. So there's quite a long section of the Watts truck, maybe 3 or 4 feet, and bear in mind a little bit of the truck is actually protruding inside the garage, enough that would be able to fit into, if you look carefully, the Lexus in the garage is far enough in that you can open the boot with the garage closed. The trunk, sorry, you can open the trunk of the Lexus, the rear trunk, with the garage door closed, and it opens without touching the door. And that gives you an idea that there are 3 or 4 feet inside the door where Watts can sort of reverse the truck in. And then there's also 2 or 3 feet outside the door that the camera can't see him. And so during that time, Watts is obviously able to load things into that section of the truck where nothing can be seen, and one's got to wonder what those things were, because he didn't back the truck up right into the garage for nothing. He didn't just back it up for nothing. Bear in mind, he later pulled it forward. So what was he doing? So we're going to get a much better view, like an aerial view and a side view, in the part dealing with the limits to CCTV footage or cameras. But what I want to deal with now quite briefly is the red gas can narrative, and we're going to go back to what Chris Watts says about it at Dodge Correctional when he was asked, why did you pack in a red gas can? What was the gas for? Let's listen into what he says.
I think I saw on the video that you put a gas can or something in the back of your truck. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Did you have different plans when you put that in there?
I don't know what was going through my head. I felt like maybe I could just get rid of myself at the same time if I was doing all this, honestly.
Yeah.
Did you just think about that?
What'd you think about that?
I felt like I deserved to live after what had happened.
Was there any thought to the whole family going away that day, to include you?
After everything happened, that's a definite thought.
Yeah. See, it's interesting to me. We had all kind of wondered if there was a point when you were all together and if you were all going to pass together. That to me makes sense, because that's, even though it sounds crazy, that's what a family man does, right?
Family man doesn't do what he did.
No, I know. I guess what I mean is, it seems like you guys were going to be together forever in that way. Is that maybe what was going through your head?
Honestly, I just felt like I deserved to live.
Yeah.
And it was like, whatever judgment I was going to come upon myself, I just didn't deserve to be on this earth anymore. Mm-hmm. What happened?
So what made you not do that, do you think?
I don't know if it was just more of like because with the site, maybe it was just more of like, I would have hurt more people than just me and everybody else. Like, I know there was other people out there, not like at the site, but other people like maybe out in the area. Like, I didn't want something like on the site to catch fire and blow up, and then other people around would get hurt in the same.
So you were thinking initially about starting a fire out there, or an explosion or something, or?
Just, no, not for that. Just like maybe I could just take care of myself and not have been dead.
How?
Gasoline, that's the only thing you do. I mean, I don't have a gun. I don't have anything like that. It's not like you can just commit suicide that way. But
So
it's
just
like,
to blow yourself up?
I mean, it was just, I wasn't thinking.
Yeah.
I don't have weapons. I've never hunted before in my life. I don't know nothing was right that morning.
So I don't know what you guys think of that nonsense. Watts talking about what would have been a true annihilation if he'd killed himself, and he's trying to convince the FBI, coder, that he was thinking about killing himself, and that is just not the case. That is not the case. He wasn't thinking of killing himself. He was thinking of living happily ever after with Kissinger, and the Sermon on the Porch shows just how happy he was. He's chuckling, he is sort of smiling, smirking. Something Officer Lyon said as well, that he would sometimes smile, and it was very inappropriate. And he didn't seem to show any concern about his family, he didn't show any emotion, any grief, except levity. And so the fact that he could, if he was feeling suicidal, that he would sort of appear to be so nonchalant and actually lighthearted, shows that he certainly wasn't suicidal at all. But that then raises the question, what was the red gas can for? And I would like to submit a couple of possibilities. One is, and I'll show the video in the clip after this, but you see him loading the gas can, or attempting to load it, and then he doesn't load it, and he sort of puts it down. Then he loads it again, but all of this is happening on the Trinastic side of the camera. And it's clearly a red gas can. You can see it's a gas can. You can see it's red. You can see what he's got in his hands. And to me, this is what's trying to deceive. This is what's knowing he's on camera and doing a little act for the camera. Watch me trying to load a red gas can. And sort of like trying to show that what he was doing that morning was completely innocent. And so it's kind of almost like waving a flag and doing sort of cheerleading for the narrative that I'm not murdering my family, I'm not getting rid of bodies, I'm just loading innocent things like gas cans, right? That's why I think he did it. On the other hand, you could also say that the gas can contained gas, and what that was used for was to wet down the bodies of his children, because petroleum is like a lubricant. It's slippery, easy to slip on it, and that would also get rid of evidence of himself pouring petroleum over his children before putting them in the gas can. Before putting them in the oil tank. I also think it's possible that he covered them in Vaseline, and that is the reason why I mentioned something about them covering the bathroom in Vaseline. I think that is certainly possible. And that wouldn't really be traceable because it's the same kind of constituents of the crude oil. The other possibility, I think, is that he did possibly want to set fire to certain items of clothing and maybe other things. But to be honest, I think that's quite far-fetched, because he wouldn't have had time to do that, and a fire would be something that would be easily visible. And fire is the one thing that people in the oil industry try and avoid. So I don't think that was the case. I do think it makes for a very shocking, titillating narrative that Chris Watts wanted to blow up an installation. I think that's a very exciting thing, and you can get maybe some YouTube traction out of that. But I just think, other than that, it's sort of nonsensical. There's also the practical and logistical need for the red gas can, which is if you're riding around Roggan, you might need some gas. You know, if you're in an area where there are not many gas stations and you're going to cover quite a lot of territory, you might need extra gas. Doesn't that make sense? And now we come to the driveway, and after that the shadows in the driveway. And at this point I'm going to say goodbye to the folks on YouTube. We're already at about 33 minutes into this episode. So thank you for joining us. Let me just say, because those of you on YouTube won't get the answer to this question unless you join Patreon. But obviously I asked you 3 questions at the beginning. The answer, or part of the answer to the second question, is that Shanann wasn't actually wearing jeans in the CCTV footage. And that is an example of cognitive bias, is you think she was wearing jeans, and so you might be looking for jeans somewhere in the house, but those weren't jeans. Even though they looked like jeans, they weren't jeans. And I deal with exactly what they were at the end of the episode, dealing with the shortcomings of CCTV footage. So anyway, thank you for listening. If you want to listen to the rest of the episode, it'll be on the $2 tier on Patreon. And now we continue with part 2 in Deep Dive.